For a long time, I thought mental strength was something you either had or didn't. I believed some men were just built tougher, born calmer, more confident, more resilient. It took me years to understand how wrong that was. What I learned over 25 years is this. Mental strength isn't talent, it's accumulation. It's built quietly through moments no one applauds. Through reactions you choose not to have. Through days you show up even when nothing inside you feels ready. Most of my early years were messy. I reacted too fast. I spoke when silence would have been stronger. I chased approval, chased certainty, chased the feeling of being in control and lost it every time. I didn't break because life was unfair. I broke because I kept letting my emotions make decisions for me. There were years where progress felt invisible. Or years where doing the right thing brought no immediate reward. Years where it would have been easier to quit, numb out or distract myself into comfort. And I won't pretend I handled those years perfectly. I didn't. But every mistake left a mark. And over time, those marks turned into lessons. This audiobook isn't about becoming fearless. It's about becoming steady. It's not about domination or hype or pushing harder than everyone else. It's about learning how to stand still when everything inside you wants to react. How to stay grounded when the world pulls at your attention. How to keep your word to yourself when no one is watching. Mental strength, as I've come to know it, looks calm. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't argue to be right. It doesn't rush. It waits. It observes. And then it acts with clarity. Over 25 years, I learned that strength grows when you stop trying to win every moment. When you stop explaining yourself to people who aren't listening. When you stop outsourcing your peace to circumstances you can't control. I learned that discipline beats motivation every time. That silence protects energy. That consistency matters more than intensity. And that the strongest men aren't the loudest, they're the most composed. This hour is not a shortcut, it's a compression. Everything you'll hear has been tested through failure, pressure, regret, and long stretches of uncertainty. No theories, no trends. Just what remains after experience strips away what doesn't work. If you're listening to this because you feel tired of reacting, tired of overthinking, tired of feeling pulled in every direction, you're not weak, you're just untrained. Your mental strength is trainable. And it starts with awareness, not force. Over the next 60 minutes, I'll walk you through 8 lessons that stayed with me after 25 years of living, failing, learning, and refining. Not lessons meant to impress you, but lessons meant to hold you steady when life gets heavy. You don't need to change everything today. You only need to begin choosing differently. Take what resonates, leave what doesn't. And most importantly, listen slowly because strength doesn't arrive all at once. It's built quietly, one decision at a time. Chapter 1. Strength started when I stopped reacting. For most of my early life, I believed reacting quickly was a form of strength. If something bothered me, I responded immediately. If someone crossed a line, I pushed back. If I felt disrespected, I made sure it was known. At the time, it felt like confidence. In reality, it was a lack of control. I didn't understand that every reaction was a leak of power. I thought standing my ground meant proving a point. What I didn't see was how often my emotions were deciding for me. How easily other people could pull me into states I didn't choose. There were countless small moments. Arguments that didn't need to happen. Conversations that escalated because I couldn't let something go. Days that ended heavier than they started. Not because life was hard, but because I carried every emotional hit with me. No one teaches you this when you're young. You're told to speak up, to assert yourself, to never let anyone disrespect you. But no one tells you that reacting to everything is exhausting. And no one tells you how expensive it is. I remember a period in my life where I felt constantly tense, not angry all the time, but always on edge. Like I was waiting for the next thing to respond to, the next comment, the next inconvenience, the next moment that required me to prove something. That state drains you quietly. You don't notice it day to day, but over months and years, it wears you down. The turning point didn't come from a book or a speech. It came from exhaustion. I realized I was tired. Not physically, but mentally. Tired of replaying conversations, tired of justifying myself, and tired of carrying reactions long after the moment had passed. That's when I noticed something uncomfortable. The calmest people around me weren't the ones reacting fastest. They weren't the loudest. They weren't the most defensive. They were the ones who paused. They didn't rush to respond. They didn't explain themselves to everyone. They didn't treat every comment like a challenge. At first I misread that calm as weakness, but over time I saw how grounded they were, how little external chaos seemed to move them. That's when the idea began to form. What if strength isn't in the reaction, but in the restraint? I started experimenting with something simple. I delayed my responses. Not forever, just long enough to create space. When something irritated me, I didn't answer immediately. When someone said something sharp, I didn't match the energy. When I felt misunderstood, I didn't rush to correct it. At first, this felt unnatural, almost like I was swallowing something, like I was letting things slide that shouldn't slide. But something unexpected happened. Most situations resolved themselves without my involvement. Tension dissolved when it wasn't fed. People revealed more about themselves when I stayed quiet. And more importantly, I felt lighter. That pause became a form of protection. It separated what was happening from how I responded. And in that separation, clarity showed up. I began to see how many of my reactions weren't necessary. How often I was reacting to tone instead of intent. How often my ego wanted to speak before my judgment had a chance. Strength didn't come from suppressing emotion. It came from choosing what deserved my energy. And there's a difference. Suppressing emotion is pretending you don't feel. Control is acknowledging the feeling and not letting it drive. Over time, this practice changed how I moved through the world. I stopped treating every moment like a test. I stopped assuming every challenge required a response. Not everything is a threat. Not everything needs your voice. Not everything deserves your attention. That realization alone saved me years of unnecessary conflict. I also noticed something else. People started reacting to me differently. When you don't react the way people expect, it unsettles them. Not in a threatening way, but in a grounding way. They slow down. They become more careful with their words. Silence, when chosen consciously, carries weight. I wasn't trying to dominate conversations anymore. I was listening, observing, and responding only when it mattered. And when I did speak, my words landed heavier. This is where mental strength actually began for me. Not in pushing harder, not improving more, but in learning when not to engage. There's a kind of power that comes from being unmovable. Not stubborn, but steady. Life will always present friction. People will always project. Circumstances will always test you. The question is whether you let those things decide your state of mind. Reacting hands control to the moment. Pausing takes it back. Over years, this habit compounds. You argue less. You recover faster. You conserve energy for what actually matters. You stop living in reaction mode and start living deliberately. And that's when strength becomes visible. Not to others first, but to yourself. You trust yourself more. You respect your own restraint. You feel grounded even when situations aren't. Mental strength doesn't start with force. It starts with space. The space between stimulus and response. The space where choice lives. Once I learned to protect that space, everything else followed. Chapter 2. Pain was the teacher I couldn't avoid. For a long time, I tried to outrun pain. I didn't call it that back then. I called it staying positive, staying busy, staying productive. But looking back, it was avoidance. Whenever something hurt, failure, rejection, disappointment, I looked for a way around it. I distracted myself. I rationalized it. I told myself it didn't matter. But pain doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It waits. In my earlier years, every setback felt personal. If something didn't work out, I questioned my worth. If someone walked away, I replayed the moment over and over, trying to rewrite it in my head. If I failed publicly, I carried the weight privately. I thought strength meant not feeling those things. I thought strong men didn't sit with discomfort. They moved on fast. They stayed unfazed. And that belief cost me years. Pain kept showing up in different forms. Missed opportunities, broken trust, moments where I knew I could have handled things better but didn't. Each time I looked for relief instead of understanding, and each time the lesson came back louder. The shift happened slowly, not all at once. I started noticing a pattern. Every time I avoided pain, it returned stronger. Every time I numbed it, it extended its stay. Eventually, I reached a point where distraction stopped working. The discomfort followed me even into the things I used to enjoy. Rest didn't feel like rest anymore. Silence felt heavy instead of peaceful. That's when I stopped asking, how do I get rid of this? And started asking, what is this trying to show me? That question changed everything. Pain, I realized, isn't random. It points. It highlights what's misaligned. It exposes habits that no longer serve you. When I finally sat with it without trying to fix it, justify it, or escape it, I saw clearly. Some of my pain came from choices I kept repeating. Some came from expectations I never questioned. Some came from holding on to versions of myself that were already outdated. None of that felt good to admit. But it was honest. Mental strength didn't grow when the pain disappeared. It grew when I stopped running from it. I learned that discomfort isn't the enemy. Resistance is. There's a difference between pain that sharpens you and pain that erodes you. The difference is attention. When you face pain directly, it teaches. When you avoid it, it lingers. I started doing something uncomfortable on purpose. When something hurt, I stayed with it a little longer, near not to suffer, but to understand. I asked myself hard questions. What part of this is my responsibility? What am I refusing to let go of? What pattern is repeating here? Those questions didn't always have immediate answers. Sometimes they just sat there unresolved. But even that was progress because for the first time I wasn't numbing the signal. Over time, I noticed something surprising. The intensity of pain decreased. Not because life got easier, but because I stopped adding resistance. I stopped telling myself it shouldn't feel this way. I stopped comparing my timeline to others. I stopped expecting growth without discomfort. Pain became information, not identity. That shift brought a quiet confidence, not optimism, but stability. I trusted myself more knowing I could sit with discomfort without collapsing or reacting blindly. I didn't need immediate relief anymore. I needed clarity. This is where many men get stuck. They confuse strength with comfort. They build their lives around avoiding anything that feels heavy. But avoidance creates fragility. If your peace depends on everything going smoothly, it isn't peace, it's luck. Mental strength is knowing you can remain steady even when things feel wrong. Even when answers aren't clear, even when the discomfort stays longer than you'd like. I also learned that pain has layers. The first layer hurts. The deeper layer teaches, and beneath that is release. But you only reach that point if you stay present. This doesn't mean you dwell. It means you don't rush yourself out of the experience. I stopped asking pain to leave. I asked it to finish its message. That alone prevented countless repeated mistakes. The strongest people I've met weren't pain-free. They were pain-literate. They knew what to listen for. They knew when discomfort meant adjustment and when it meant endurance. That literacy isn't taught, It's earned. And it earns you something valuable. Resilience that doesn't rely on circumstances. Over years of facing discomfort instead of escaping it, I became less reactive, less defensive, more grounded. I didn't need everything to feel good to function well. That's real strength. Pain didn't make me bitter. Avoidance almost did. Once I understood that, I stopped seeing hardship as an interruption. I saw it as part of the process, not something to fear. Not something to rush past, but something to move through deliberately. Mental strength isn't about seeking pain. It's about not wasting it. When you stop running, pain stops chasing. And in that stillness, clarity finally has room to speak. Chapter 3. Discipline replaced motivation. For a long time, I waited to feel ready. Ready to start. Ready to commit. Ready to be consistent. I told myself I was being patient, that I was waiting for the right moment, the right mindset, the right energy. What I didn't realize was that I was outsourcing responsibility to motivation, and motivation is unreliable. In the early years, I believed motivation was the engine of progress. When I felt inspired, I worked harder. When I felt confident, I showed up fully. When motivation disappeared, so did my discipline. That cycle felt normal. It felt human, and it quietly kept me stuck. There were stretches of time where I made strong starts and weak finishes. I'd commit intensely for a few weeks, then fade. I'd promise myself consistency, then negotiate excuses when the feeling wasn't there. See, I wasn't lazy. I was inconsistent, and inconsistency eroded self-rust faster than failure ever could. Each time I broke a promise to myself, something small but important weakened. Not my ability, but my belief that I could rely on myself. That's when I started noticing something about the people I admired most. They weren't always motivated. In fact, many of them rarely talked about motivation at all. They talked about standards, routines, non-negotiables. They didn't wait to feel like doing the work. They did the work because that's who they had decided to be. That idea challenged me. I had built my identity around how I felt. They had built theirs around what they did. The shift didn't happen overnight. At first, discipline felt cold, rigid, unforgiving. Motivation felt exciting. Discipline felt boring, but boredom turned out to be powerful. I started small, not because small was easier, but because it was sustainable. I stopped aiming for intensity and aimed for repeatability. On days when I felt sharp, I did the work. On days when I felt dull, I did the work. On days when nothing inside me wanted to move, I did the work anyway. Just less of it. That's when something unexpected happened. Progress stopped depending on my mood. I no longer needed to wake up feeling inspired to move forward. I only needed to follow the system I had already chosen. Discipline became a form of self-respect, not punishment, not force. Respect. I wasn't pushing myself to prove anything. I was showing up because I said I would. Over time, that consistency rebuilt something motivation never could. Trust. I trusted myself to act even when conditions weren't ideal. As I trusted my ability to stay steady when enthusiasm faded, I trusted that momentum could exist without excitement. That trust was grounding. There's a myth that discipline kills creativity or freedom. In my experience, it did the opposite. Once my actions were no longer dependent on how I felt, my mind became quieter, less negotiation, less internal debate, less friction. I wasn't asking myself every day whether I should act. The decision had already been made. Mental strength grew in that simplicity. I also learned that discipline doesn't mean doing everything. It means doing what matters consistently. I stopped overwhelming myself with unrealistic expectations. I focused on a few behaviors I could sustain even on my worst days. That's where discipline becomes real. Anyone can be disciplined when life is smooth. And strength is built when discipline survives friction. There were days when I wanted to quit routines I had committed to. Days when skipping felt harmless. Just this once. Just today. But every time I honored the commitment instead, something shifted internally. Not immediately, but cumulatively, I became less reactive to discomfort, less dramatic about effort, more neutral toward resistance. Work became something I did, not something I argued with. This wasn't about grinding endlessly. It was about removing unnecessary emotion from action. Discipline made effort quieter. I no longer needed to hype myself up. I didn't need external validation. I didn't need perfect conditions. I needed consistency. And consistency, repeated long enough, builds identity. I stopped seeing myself as someone who tries when motivated. I started seeing myself as someone who follows through. That identity changed how I carried myself, how I made decisions, how I handled pressure. When challenges came, I didn't panic. I defaulted to structure. Motivation is emotional. Discipline is structural. Emotions fluctuate. Structures hold. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Mental strength isn't about feeling powerful. It's about remaining functional when you don't. Discipline gives you that stability. It doesn't eliminate resistance. It removes its authority. Over years of choosing discipline over motivation, I noticed another shift. My emotions stabilized, not because I suppressed them, but because they weren't running the show anymore. I could feel tired without stopping, feel bored without quitting, feel uncertain without freezing. That's freedom. The irony is that motivation came back once it wasn't required. It showed up as a byproduct, not a prerequisite. But even when it disappeared again, nothing collapsed. That's the quiet strength discipline builds. You stop needing to be convinced. You stop waiting to feel ready. You act from decision, not emotion. And once you experience that stability, it's hard to go back. Discipline doesn't make you rigid. It makes you reliable, and reliability to yourself is one of the strongest forms of mental strength there is. Chapter 4. I learned to control my inner dialogue. For a long time, I didn't realize how much damage my own voice was doing. Not the voice I used with other people, but the one that spoke when no one else was around. The one that narrated my failures. The one that commented quietly when things didn't go as planned. That voice was always there, critical, impatient, unforgiving. I thought it was helping me stay sharp. I told myself I was being honest, that I was holding myself to a high standard, but honesty without balance becomes sabotage. Every mistake triggered a familiar script. You should have known better. Why do you always do this? You're falling behind. Others are handling this better than you. I didn't notice it at first because it felt normal. I assumed everyone talked to themselves this way. So, I assumed mental strength meant tolerating that pressure. What I didn't see was how that inner dialogue was shaping my behavior. It didn't push me forward. It made me tense. It narrowed my thinking. It made every challenge feel heavier than it needed to be. Over time, I realized something uncomfortable. The way I spoke to myself. I would never speak to someone I respected. That realization stopped me cold. If strength was about control, then why was I letting my own mind run unchecked? I began paying attention, not to my thoughts, but to the tone behind them. There's a difference between guidance and attack, between correction and condemnation. My inner voice wasn't correcting me. It was punishing me. And punishment doesn't build discipline, it builds avoidance. I started noticing patterns. When my inner dialogue was harsh, I procrastinated more. When it was rigid, I resisted effort. When I was impatient, I rushed to make decisions. The voice that claimed to push me was actually slowing me down. Mental strength, I learned, isn't about silencing that voice. It's about training it. I didn't try to replace it with positivity. That felt fake. Forced optimism only created more resistance. Instead, I aimed for something simpler. Neutrality. When I made a mistake, I stopped labeling myself. No more I'm failing. No more I'm not cut out for this. I focused on behavior, not identity. What happened? What can be adjusted? What's the next step? That shift alone reduced internal friction. I wasn't letting my mind spiral into conclusions. I was keeping it grounded in the process. At first, this took effort. The old voice didn't disappear quietly. It pushed back and it insisted it was necessary, but I stayed consistent. Each time the inner dialogue turned sharp, I interrupted it, not with encouragement, but with clarity. This isn't helpful. This isn't accurate. This isn't moving me forward. That practice changed how I experienced pressure. I stopped taking every thought as truth. I started treating them as suggestions, some useful, some not. That distance created stability. I also learned that fatigue makes the inner voice louder. Stress sharpens it. Isolation amplifies it. So, I adjusted. I didn't try to fix my thinking when I was exhausted. I focused on recovery first, rest, routine, silence. Mental strength isn't just about what you think, it's about when you think. Trying to reason with yourself while exhausted is like arguing with a storm. I began respecting my limits instead of fighting them. And another shift came when I stopped rehearsing imaginary conversations. Those mental debates, explaining myself, defending decisions, replaying conflicts were draining me. They created pressure without resolution. I made a decision to limit those loops. If a conversation hadn't happened, I didn't let it live rent-free in my mind. If something was unresolved, I acknowledged it and moved on. That wasn't avoidance. It was containment. Not every thought deserves attention. Not every mental scenario deserves energy. This was difficult at first. Letting go felt irresponsible, like I was missing something important. But over time, the quiet that followed felt expansive. I wasn't constantly reacting to imagined futures or rewritten pasts. I was present, and presence strengthens the mind. I also noticed how language shaped my endurance. Small shifts mattered. I have to became I chose to. I can't became not right now. This is impossible became this is uncomfortable. None of these changes were dramatic on their own, but repeated daily, they rewired how I experienced effort. The work didn't change. My relationship to it did. Mental strength isn't built by forcing confidence. It's built by removing unnecessary self-resistance. I stopped expecting my mind to always be cooperative. I stopped trying to eliminate doubt. Instead, I learned to move forward with doubt present. That's control. Not control over thoughts, but control over response. There were still days when the inner dialogue turned negative. That never fully went away. But it lost its authority. It could speak, but it couldn't decide. That distinction is critical. Once I separated awareness from identification, pressure lost its grip. I wasn't my thoughts. I was the one hearing them. That space changed everything. Decisions became cleaner. Emotions passed faster. Setbacks felt temporary instead of defining. I wasn't dragged down by every internal comment. Over years, this discipline reshaped my inner world. The voice became steadier, less reactive, more grounded, not encouraging, not cruel, clear. That clarity carried into how I spoke, how I acted, how I handled conflict. Mental strength grew from the inside out. I learned that the most important conversation you'll ever have is the one no one hears. And if you don't train that voice, it will train you, often in ways you don't choose. Controlling your inner dialogue isn't about dominance. It's about alignment. Aligning thought with action, aligning intention with behavior. When that alignment holds, pressure doesn't break you, it defines you. And that refinement repeated over time becomes quiet, durable strength. Chapter 5. Silence became a weapon. There was a time when I believed speaking up was always the right move. If I had a thought, I shared it. If something bothered me, I explained it. If I felt misunderstood, I clarified again and again. I equated expression with strength. Silence felt passive, almost like surrender. But over the years, I learned that most of my words weren't adding value. They were leaking energy. I didn't notice it at first. Talking feels productive. Explaining feels responsible. Defending yourself feels necessary. But slowly I realized how often I was speaking out of discomfort, not intention. I spoke to relieve tension. I spoke to be understood. I spoke to regain a sense of control. And every time I did, I gave something away. Silence entered my life not as a strategy, but as a consequence. I got tired of repeating myself. Tired of conversations that went nowhere. Tired of explaining things to people who had already decided what they believed. At some point, I stopped responding. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. And that's when I saw what silence really does. Silence reveals. When you stop filling the space, other people do. They explain themselves. They project. They expose intentions that words often hide. I learned more by listening than I ever did by arguing. In the beginning, silence felt uncomfortable. There's an urge to jump in, to correct, to defend. Your mind tells you that if you don't speak now, you'll lose your position. But most of the time, that isn't true. Most of the time, nothing needs to be said. Silence isn't weakness. Uncontrolled speech is. Once I started choosing silence deliberately, something shifted internally. My thoughts slowed down. My reactions softened. I wasn't constantly preparing my next response. I was present. That presence changed the quality of my interactions. When I did speak, people listened. Not because I raised my voice, but because I didn't waste it. Words carry weight when they aren't overused. I also noticed how silence protected my energy. Conversations stopped draining me. I didn't leave interactions replaying what I should have said differently. I wasn't carrying other people's opinions home with me. I stopped explaining myself to people who weren't committed to understanding. And in doing so, I reclaimed hours of mental space. There's a difference between clarity and justification. Clarity is clean. Justification is endless. Silence helped me tell the difference. I didn't go silent everywhere. This wasn't about withdrawal or avoidance. It was about selectivity. I spoke when it mattered. I stayed quiet when it didn't. That discernment is a form of strength. One of the hardest lessons was learning not to respond to provocation. Not every comment is a conversation starter. Some are invitations to chaos. In the past, I accepted every invitation. Now I decline most of them. Silence disarms provocation. It denies oxygen. People often escalate when they don't get the reaction they expect. But eventually escalation collapses under its own weight. Silence also forced me to sit with my own discomfort. When you don't speak, you can't offload tension onto someone else. You have to process it internally. That processing builds capacity. Instead of venting, I reflected. Instead of reacting, I observed. Instead of explaining, and I adjusted my behavior. That internal work was quieter, but far more effective. I also learned that silence strengthens boundaries. You don't need to announce them. You enforce them through consistency. When you stop engaging with what drains you, people notice. When you stop justifying your choices, they adjust or they leave. Both outcomes are clear. Silence simplified my life. I wasn't trying to be mysterious or distant. I was trying to be precise. I noticed how often people speak to fill space, not to communicate. Once I stopped doing that, conversations became more meaningful. There were pauses. There was breathing room. There was space for thought, and in that space, real connection sometimes happened. But even when it didn't, I wasn't depleted. Mental strength isn't loud. It doesn't rush to be heard, and it doesn't need constant validation. Silence embodies that. It says, I'm not threatened by this moment. I don't need to control the narrative. I trust my position enough not to defend it endlessly. That trust is powerful. I also learned that silence isn't always external. It's internal, too. I reduced the noise inside my own head. Fewer rehearsed arguments, fewer imaginary explanations. I let things be unresolved without chasing closure. That was uncomfortable at first, but it freed me from mental loops that led nowhere. Not everything needs resolution today. Not every misunderstanding needs correction. Not every thought needs expression. Silence teaches patience. Over time, I noticed how this practice changed my posture in the world. I was calmer, more grounded, less reactive. I wasn't trying to win conversations. I was conserving energy for life, and energy, once conserved, compounds. When challenges came, I wasn't already exhausted from unnecessary battles. I had reserves. Silence helped me choose my battles wisely, and often to choose none at all. That's not avoidance. That's mastery. There's a kind of authority that comes from restraint. People feel it, even if they can't name it. You don't need to explain your strength. You demonstrate it through consistency and composure. Silence gave me that composure. It taught me that saying less often means living more. That presence beats performance. That restraint is not repression. It's control. In a world that rewards noise, silence is a discipline. And like all disciplines, it strengthens what you practice. I didn't lose my voice. I refined it, and in doing so, I found that silence, when chosen, is one of the sharpest tools mental strength can offer. Chapter 6. Mental strength is doing the right thing. Unseen. For a long time, I believed effort only mattered if it was visible. If no one noticed, it felt optional. If there was no recognition, it felt pointless. That belief shaped more of my behavior than I realized. I worked harder when eyes were on me. I stayed disciplined when accountability was external. And when no one was watching, my standards quietly dropped. Not dramatically, just enough to feel harmless. Skip this once. Delay that today. No one will know. But I knew. And over time, that knowledge eroded something important. There's a subtle difference between who you appear to be and who you actually are. That difference is built in private. Mental strength doesn't show itself when conditions are perfect. It reveals itself when there's no audience, no pressure, no immediate consequence. It took years for that to fully land. I noticed a pattern in my own life. The times I felt most grounded weren't tied to public wins. They were tied to quiet consistency. Getting up when I said I would. Finishing what I started even when it was boring. Choosing restraint when indulgence was easier. None of those moments looked impressive from the outside, but they accumulated internally. They built self-respect, and self-respect is the foundation of mental strength. You can't fake it. You either have it or you don't. I began to understand that unseen actions shape identity. Every small decision reinforces a story about who you are. When you cut corners in private, you tell yourself a story of convenience. When you hold standards unseen, you tell yourself a story of integrity. That story becomes instinct. There were many moments where I had a choice. No one would know which option I picked. Both choices led to similar outcomes in the short term, but one felt heavier, the other felt cleaner. Choosing the heavier path didn't make me feel good immediately. It made me feel aligned. Alignment lasts longer than pleasure. I stopped asking whether something would be noticed. I started asking whether it would strengthen or weaken my character. That question simplified decisions. Mental strength grew from repetition. From making the same hard choice when it didn't matter publicly. That repetition created reliability not to others, to myself. I could trust my own follow-through. Trust changes how you carry pressure. When you know you'll do what's required regardless of visibility, anxiety drops. You're no longer negotiating with yourself, not as you're executing. There's a quiet confidence that comes from that. Not arrogance, not bravado. Confidence rooted in evidence. I also realized that unseen discipline prepares you for visible pressure. When challenges arrive publicly, you don't rise to the occasion. You fall back on habits. And habits are built when no one's clapping. This applies everywhere. How you handle fatigue when no one's pushing you. How you manage temptation when there's no consequence. How you treat commitments that only you remember. Those moments define strength more than crisis ever will. Crisis just exposes what's already there. I stopped romanticizing pressure. I stopped waiting for dramatic tests. The real test happens daily in quiet moments, in decisions that feel insignificant. That's where mental strength is trained. I noticed something else as well. When I began holding myself to private standards, my need for validation decreased. I didn't need praise to feel steady. I didn't need recognition to feel grounded. I already knew what I was capable of. I had evidence. That internal certainty is stabilizing. It makes you less reactive to opinion, less dependent on outcomes, less shaken by temporary setbacks. You're not guessing who you are. You've seen it repeatedly. There were days when this discipline felt tedious. Days when it would have been easier to relax standards, days when consistency felt thankless. But those were the days that mattered most. Anyone can perform when it's exciting. Strength shows up when it's monotonous. I learned to respect boredom. Boredom is where discipline proves itself. I didn't chase intensity anymore. I chased continuity. Doing the right thing unseen also clarified my values. It forced me to decide what actually mattered. Not what looked good. Not what sounded impressive. What mattered when stripped of performance. That clarity simplified my life. I stopped overcommitting. I stopped saying yes to things I wouldn't follow through on privately. I aligned promises with capacity. That alignment reduced friction. Mental strength isn't about pushing endlessly. It's about consistency within limits. Unseen discipline also changed how I handled temptation. Instead of resisting aggressively, I created structure. I removed unnecessary friction points. I set rules in advance. When decisions are made ahead of time, willpower becomes irrelevant. That's real strength. Not heroic resistance, but intelligent design. I stopped relying on mood. I relied on systems. And systems don't care how you feel. They function quietly daily. Over time, this way of living reshaped my self-image. I wasn't someone who tried hard occasionally. I was someone who followed through reliably. That shift mattered more than any external success because success fluctuates. Identity stabilizes. Mental strength built in private shows up publicly without effort. You don't have to summon it. It's already there. You respond calmly under pressure because calm is familiar. You stay disciplined during chaos because discipline is routine. Nothing feels forced. That's the payoff of unseen work. And I also learned that cutting corners privately always shows up eventually. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But it shows up as hesitation, as self-doubt, as instability. The mind remembers everything. When you know you've compromised, confidence weakens. When you know you've held the line, confidence solidifies. That's why private standards matter so much. They're not about morality. They're about coherence. Living in a way that doesn't fracture your self-respect. Mental strength is coherence under pressure. And coherence is built when no one's looking. I stopped trying to impress an audience that wasn't there. I focused on becoming someone I could rely on. That decision simplified everything. Doing the right thing unseen doesn't make life easier. It makes you stronger. And over time, strength makes life steadier. You stop seeking shortcuts. You stop bargaining with discomfort. You stop needing external structure to function. You carry structure within. That's when mental strength stops being situational. It becomes who you are. Chapter 7. I stopped trying to win every moment. For many years, I treated life like a series of small battles. Every conversation had a winner and a loser. Every disagreement felt like a test. Every challenge demanded a response. I didn't see it as aggression. I saw it as engagement, as strength, as staying sharp. But living that way quietly exhausted me. I was always alert, always evaluating, always preparing to defend or explain, even when nothing was actually at stake. Winning every moment became a habit. And like most habits, it shaped me more than I realized. I argued over details that didn't matter. I corrected people who weren't asking to be corrected. I pushed back on opinions that had no impact on my life. Each time, I felt a small sense of control. And each time I paid for it with energy. The cost didn't show up immediately. It accumulated. Mental fatigue, irritation, a constant low-level tension that followed me everywhere. I didn't understand why I felt drained. I was doing everything right, standing my ground, not letting things slide. But strength isn't measured by how much you resist. It's measured by how well you choose. The shift began when I noticed something about the calmest people I knew. They weren't disengaged. They weren't passive. They were selective. They didn't react to every comment. They didn't correct every misunderstanding. They didn't turn every difference into a confrontation. They let things pass. At first, that looked like indifference, but it wasn't. It was discernment. They knew what mattered and what didn't. I realized I had been spending energy trying to win moments that offered no real return. Yeah, moments that didn't move my life forward. Moments that only fed my ego. And ego is expensive. The day I stopped trying to win everything was the day I started conserving strength. I began asking a simple question before responding: does this actually matter tomorrow? Most of the time the answer was no. That question changed my behavior more than any rule ever could. When I didn't engage, something interesting happened. The world didn't collapse. People didn't walk all over me. Respect didn't disappear. In fact, the opposite happened. The less I fought, the steadier I became. The steadier I became, the less people tested me. Not because I was intimidating, but because I wasn't reactive. There's a quiet authority in someone who doesn't need to win every exchange. I also learned that winning moments often means losing perspective. You focus so tightly on being right that you forget to ask whether being right even matters. Many arguments are about control, not truth, about identity, not resolution. Once I saw that, it became easier to step back. I stopped treating disagreement as a threat. I stopped interpreting differences as disrespect. Not everyone is speaking to challenge you. Sometimes they're just speaking from their own confusion. And sometimes the strongest response is none at all. Letting go of the need to win felt uncomfortable at first. It felt like I was leaving something unresolved. Like I was allowing something to stand that shouldn't. But over time, I realized that peace doesn't come from resolving everything. It comes from accepting that not everything needs resolution. Mental strength isn't about closure. It's about tolerance. A tolerance for ambiguity. Tolerance for disagreement. Tolerance for things remaining unfinished. I also noticed how much lighter my relationships became. Fewer arguments, less tension, more space. When I stopped trying to win, conversations became less performative. There was less posturing, less defense. I listened more. I spoke less. And when I did speak, it was intentional. Another realization followed. Trying to win every moment was often a way of avoiding uncertainty. If I could dominate the conversation, I didn't have to sit with not knowing. If I could prove a point, I didn't have to examine my own position. Letting go of that habit forced me to be honest with myself. Sometimes I didn't know the answer. Sometimes I was wrong. Sometimes the truth was more complex than I wanted it to be. Mental strength grew when I allowed that complexity. Certainty is comforting, but it's often shallow. Strength comes from holding uncertainty without panic. I stopped reacting to things just to reassure myself. I allowed silence. I allowed pause. That pause created space for better judgment. I also became more aware of timing. Even when something needs to be addressed, Not every moment is the right one. Winning a moment at the wrong time can cost you more than losing it. I learned to wait. Waiting isn't weakness, it's strategy. When you stop rushing to win, you start seeing patterns. You understand people better. You notice what's worth engaging and what isn't. That awareness sharpened my decisions. I wasn't wasting energy on trivial conflicts. I was reserving it for situations that actually required strength. That reserve mattered. When real challenges arrived, ones that couldn't be ignored, I had the capacity to face them calmly. I wasn't depleted from dozens of unnecessary battles. Mental strength isn't about constant resistance. It's about endurance. Endurance requires conservation. I also noticed how letting go of small wins improved my emotional stability. I wasn't riding constant highs and lows based on interactions. My state became steadier, less dependent on external validation. I didn't need to feel superior to feel grounded. That independence is powerful. It frees you from the need to dominate. It frees you from comparison. It frees you from constant tension. I stopped measuring my worth through outcomes of conversations, son. I measured it through alignment with my values. Did I act with restraint? Did I maintain composure? Did I choose clarity over ego? Those questions replaced the need to win. Over time, this approach reshaped my identity. I wasn't someone who needed to prove himself constantly. I was someone who could choose when to engage and when to walk away. Walking away isn't quitting, it's prioritizing. You can't carry everything. You shouldn't try. Mental strength is knowing what to put down. By releasing the need to win every moment, I reclaimed energy, focus, and calm. I stopped fighting shadows. I stopped chasing validation. And in that quiet, my strength matured. Not sharp, not aggressive, steady. That steadiness carried me through situations that once would have consumed me. I didn't win every moment anymore, but I started winning where it counted, and that made all the difference. Chapter 8. Strength became calm, not hard. For a long time, I thought strength had to look a certain way. Hard, sharp, unyielding. I believed strong men were intense, driven, always pushing forward. They carried pressure visibly. They moved fast. They spoke with certainty. And for years, I tried to shape myself into that image. I tightened my jaw. I pushed through fatigue. I ignored signs that something inside was wearing down. I mistook tension for power. But tension is fragile. It cracks under pressure. What I didn't understand then was that true mental strength doesn't feel heavy. It feels stable. The shift didn't happen suddenly. It happened after enough years of friction, enough moments where force stopped working. Enough times where pushing harder only made things worse. I began noticing a pattern. The people who handled pressure best weren't the hardest. They were the calmest. They didn't rush decisions. They didn't amplify problems. They didn't meet chaos with more chaos. They slowed things down. At first, that calm confused me. I wondered if it was detachment, if they cared less. But over time, I realized they cared more, just not emotionally. They weren't numbing themselves. They were regulating themselves. That distinction changed everything. Hardness is reactive. Calm is deliberate. Hardness braces against the world. Calm stands within it. I started to feel the cost of being hard all the time. My body was tense even when nothing was wrong. My mind was always preparing for impact. I didn't feel strong. I felt guarded. That's when I understood something important. If strength requires constant effort, it isn't sustainable. Mental strength has to endure. So, I stopped trying to be hard. I focused instead on being steady. Steadiness looks unremarkable from the outside. There's no drama to it, no visible struggle. But internally, it's demanding. It requires restraint, patience, the ability to stay present without needing to escape discomfort. I learned that calm isn't passive. It's active control. It's the decision not to let your nervous system dictate your behavior, not to let urgency make choices for you. Calm allows you to think clearly when things feel unstable. Hardness narrows your focus. Calm expands it. Once I began valuing calm, my reactions changed. I didn't jump to conclusions. I didn't rush responses. I didn't escalate situations unnecessarily. I let moments breathe. That breathing room gave me options. I could see angles I used to miss. And I could hear what people were actually saying beneath their words. I could choose responses instead of defaulting to habits. Calm made me precise. I also noticed how calm affected my body. My shoulders relaxed. My breathing slowed. Sleep came easier. Mental strength isn't just psychological, it's physiological. A regulated mind lives in a regulated body. When you're calm, your body isn't constantly preparing for threat. And GT, and GT, and GT, and GT, it conserves energy. It recovers faster. That recovery compounds. I became more resilient, not because I was tougher, but because I was less depleted. There's a misconception that calm means you don't care, that you've given up intensity. In reality, calm gives intensity direction. Instead of spreading effort everywhere, you apply it where it matters. I stopped overreacting to minor stresses. That left me with capacity when real challenges appeared. And when they did, I didn't panic. I didn't need to become aggressive or forceful. I stayed composed. That composure carried authority. People feel it when you're not rattled. When you don't mirror their anxiety, when you don't rush to defend yourself. Calm communicates confidence without words. I also learned that calm makes decision-making cleaner. When emotions aren't spiking, judgment sharpens. You're less likely to regret what you choose. Less likely to say things you can't take back. Hardness often leads to repair. Calm prevents damage. Over time, I stopped equating strength with effort. I stopped measuring myself by how much I could endure. Instead, I measured myself by how well I could remain balanced. Balance doesn't mean comfort. It means proportion. Responding in proportion to reality, not emotion. That skill took years to develop. It required unlearning habits that once felt protective. But once it settled, everything changed. I no longer needed to prove strength. I embodied it quietly. Challenges didn't disappear. Life didn't soften. But my relationship to difficulty transformed. I wasn't fighting life anymore. I was moving with it. That shift freed up enormous energy. Energy that used to be spent resisting reality was now available for building something meaningful. Mental strength matured into presence. Being fully where I was without bracing for impact. Presence isn't flashy. It doesn't announce itself, but it anchors you. I could sit in uncertainty without rushing resolution. I could face criticism without internal collapse. I could experience discomfort without immediately trying to escape it. That ability is rare and it's powerful. Calm also taught me humility. Hardness often hides fear behind force. Calm acknowledges fear without letting it lead. I didn't need to dominate my emotions. I needed to understand them. Once understood, they lost their grip. I learned that calm isn't something you switch on in crisis. It's something you practice daily. In small moments, in traffic, in conversation, in silence. Each time you choose calm over reaction, you strengthen it. Over years, those choices stack until calm becomes your default. And when calm is your default, pressure loses its power over you. You don't need to become harder as life gets heavier, but you need to become steadier. That's the final lesson 25 years taught me. Mental strength doesn't peak in aggression or intensity. It settles into clarity. It becomes quiet confidence, measured response, unshakable presence. Strength at its highest level doesn't look like force. It looks so calm that nothing can pull it apart. And once you experience that kind of strength, you stop chasing anything louder. You've already arrived where power actually lives. This hour was never meant to impress you. It was meant to steady you. Everything you've heard came from years of pressure, correction, and quiet repetition. Not from moments of triumph, but from moments of adjustment. From noticing what broke me down and slowly removing it. From noticing what held me together and protecting it. Mental strength isn't a personality trait. It isn't something reserved for a certain type of man. It's a relationship you build with your own reactions, your habits, and your inner standard. Over these chapters, one pattern should be clear. Strength didn't arrive through force. It arrived through restraint, through choosing not to react, through staying present with discomfort, through discipline when motivation faded, through silence instead of explanation, through doing the right thing when no one was watching, through letting go of the need to win, through learning to stay calm instead of hard. None of this requires perfection. It requires consistency. Mental strength isn't built by dramatic change. It's built by small decisions repeated under pressure. Decisions no one celebrates. Decisions that don't feel heroic. Decisions that quietly shape who you become. You don't need to adopt every idea from this audiobook. You don't need to overhaul your life. You don't need to become someone else. You only need to choose one standard and honor it today. Maybe it's pausing before reacting. Maybe it's holding discipline without motivation. Maybe it's choosing silence instead of explanation. Maybe it's keeping a promise no one knows about. That's how strength starts. Not loudly, not all at once, but deliberately. The world will always pull at you, demand reactions, invite comparison, reward noise. Mental strength gives you the ability to remain centered inside that pull, to move without being dragged, to act without being rushed, to decide without being pressured. That steadiness becomes visible over time, in how you speak, in how you carry pressure, in how little chaos controls you. And when life becomes heavy, and it will, you won't need to search for strength. You'll already be standing in it. If there's one thing worth remembering from this hour, let it be this. You don't need a stronger world. You need a steadier mind. Everything else follows from there. Take this hour with you, not as inspiration, but as reference. Return to it when you feel pulled off center. When reactions creep back in. When pressure feels louder than clarity. Strength isn't something you achieve and keep forever. It's something you practice quietly daily on purpose. And if you do that long enough, you won't need to prove it to anyone. You'll know.